Okay, now we'll go through this really quickly. So the near future, we're going to have the 737 MAX and the A321neo operating on the Atlantic. And people think, oh, narrow bodies, you've had wide bodies for a long time. This sounds a bit odd. What's happening at the moment, British Airways are flying an A318. Now, when I first went to Cranfield teaching there, one of my colleagues that I worked with was the chief propulsion engineer, British Airways. And at that stage, British Airways had decided the A318 was a turkey. They had 50 of them on order. They came to the conclusion this was not a good aeroplane, and they scrapped the whole thing. But they kept 2. And what they did was they operated A318 all business class, only about 34 seats, from London City, which is a very short runway, to JFK, and it hadn't got the range to get across the Atlantic westbound. So what they do is they stop at Shannon westbound, but the clever thing is they stop at Shannon westbound and clear US customs. While it's refueling, they clear US customs and they get off the aeroplane in Kennedy and walk off like it was a domestic flight. So that's a very clever solution, and then it's non-stop eastbound. Now, that's, I think, they've cut back, and I think they're doing it daily now. They only have 2 aeroplanes, but that has been quite a successful service on the whole. We've also now got WestJet and Air Canada. WestJet operating 737-700s from St John's to London, and Air Canada operating the A320 from Halifax to London. I mean, the first time I was in Heathrow and I saw an Air Canada A320, I was quite surprised, because all I ever seen there was 767s and 777s. But it was a flight from Halifax. Now, currently, 757 has been widely used by charter operators from Europe to the east coast of North America. And there's some scheduled service with 757s on some secondary routes, like go from New York to Glasgow to Edinburgh to Birmingham on a 757. There's not enough traffic to justify a bigger aeroplane, and American Airlines still use it Phoenix to Hawaii. It's fairly old technology now. But now what we're starting to see is that Norwegian, the low-cost carrier, are starting the planning, they haven't done it yet, doing Copenhagen to Boston. And they see all sorts of city pairs that can support an aircraft the size of a 737 or an A320. But the A320, the Neo LR, which made its first flight a couple of weeks ago, has just demonstrated a flight the other day about, I think it was about 4,500 nautical miles. So there's an opportunity for smaller cities for direct flights. Now, so the major routes, of course, are operated with the big guys. Now, this is interesting. Now, there's an interesting picture that we may forget that the smoke used to be a problem, a big problem. But it's a long time since we saw any smoke. But it started in 1958 with the 707-120, the DC-8 and 707-320 came along in 59. Then we got on to the wide bodies starting in 1970 with the 747, the tri-jets in 1973. I remember the first time I flew on a 3-engine airplane across the Atlantic, I thought, oh, this is not a very good idea, and never mind 2 engines. Oops, sorry. And then in the late 80s, the 767 and the A310 started operating twin-engine flights across the Atlantic, and then of course the 777 came along, and now the 787. So everything now pretty well is twin-engined. Now, it's interesting to look at the early big jets, and if you look at the 707, one of the interesting things is that they increased the size of the 707 by nearly 50%. No, not quite 50%, 30% anyway. And they increased the range very substantially. But look here, and they were only able to, they only stretched the 707 by 8 feet, 8.5 feet. Look at the DC-8. Now, I can guarantee you that number's wrong. I got them from the same source, but nothing at the range like that in those days. So forget about that number. But look at what Douglas did. They increased the length of the DC-8 by 37 feet. Now, a lot of you will remember they're Canada DC-8 63s, they increased the passenger count from 189 to 259. Now, if you look at Boeing versus Douglas, the 707 had a short undercarriage, and Boeing kept the undercarriage short to keep the weight down, and that in fact limited how much they could stretch the aeroplane by. Douglas, from the beginning, planned on extending the aeroplane and a tall undercarriage, and they were able to stretch the aeroplane by 37 feet. Now, short undercarriage, limited ground clearance, difficult to increase the engine diameter. And the 737 has been suffering from that since it first came out. They had great difficulty in getting a high bypass engine on the 737, on the 737-300 and 400, and it's still affecting the MAX 50 years later. And it's also, it's interesting that because of this short landing gear, the 737-900 has quite a high landing speed compared to the other sevens because of the tail strike problem. And there's one of the major airlines, either United or American, will not fly the 737-900 into LaGuardia on a rainy day because the approach speed is too high, the landing speed is too high, so that they cannot operate into LaGuardia on the rain. That's a pretty big penalty to pay, actually.
It's a pretty horrible airport anyway to get in.
Yeah.
Especially if you're going west, yeah. Westerly approach.
Okay, now look at the old versus the second generation. And what is interesting, if you look at the 707 and the 757, you find that now about the same range, about the same number of passengers. In fact, the 757 carries more, but look at the fuel difference here. The 757 gets by half the fuel of the 707, and it's just a couple of feet longer. If you look at the DC-8 63 versus the A321, that you see how much lighter the A321 is, same range, about 40% of the fuel, and only 20 passengers less. So there was the A321. This absolutely staggered me when it came up that the A321 essentially had about the same performance as the DC-8 63. I would have never believed that. Now this is the interesting thing, we talk about narrow bodies. The 707 had a fuselage width internal of 144 inches. And Boeing kept that fuselage diameter right through 727, 737, 757, 707. When Airbus built the A320, they went to the Boeing fuselage plus 7 inches, which gave you 1 inch on the seats and 1 inch on the aisle. So the staggering thing is, when you look at it, that the A320 and the 737 are basically the same fuselage diameter as what was a very big aeroplane. When many people flew in the 707 or the DC-8, thought this was a real big aeroplane, and that's actually what we're getting back to with the A320 and the 737. So anyway, if you look at that carefully there, that again, 757-200 versus 727, same range, same passengers, half the fuel. Look at the A321 versus the DC-8 63, same range, almost the same passengers, 40% of the fuel. Now, we've already started some services with the 737. They're operating a sort of second-year route from Edinburgh to Hartford, and they're going to follow up with some other routes soon, probably this summer. Important that the C series has demonstrated already non-stop flight from London City to JFK. And they say it can do it westbound with 44 passengers in business class, and that might be quite a good market for the C series. So anyway, the thing is that the narrow bodies that you might think of as very small and what have you are really very similar to what we used to think was a bloody great airplane like the 707 and the DC-8. Now, one of the things that I think they may be optimistic in their passenger counts, because on long-range flights like that, they'll probably have to sort of make more space for galleys and toilets and what have you. Anyway, any questions on that? It's primarily due to engine efficiency, and not so much due to 2 versus 4. The main factor of 2 versus 4 is on maintenance costs. In fact, I showed the fuel burn on the A380 versus the 777, basically the same. But the 4 engines requires more maintenance than 2. Now, it's interesting, in fact, that the A340, which people look at as being not a very successful aeroplane, the A340 was outselling the Boeing 777 by a large number, and Boeing got the FAA to increase the ETOPS time by something like 15 minutes. And making that change was enough to put everywhere in range for the 777, and there wasn't a single A340 sold after that change was made. And that's why Airbus bought the A350. But obviously the aerodynamics have also improved, but the real gain is from the engine. Being an engine guy, I always say it's because the engine guys are smarter than the airplane guys, but that's a biased view. It was an amazing technical achievement. I mean, consider this, the basic design of Concorde was done in 1964-65, thereabouts, 50 years ago. And it did all they said it would do. The Americans tried to come up with a faster airplane. They failed dismally. The Boeing 2707 went through 2 redesigns and couldn't make it non-stop across the Atlantic and never flew. And the point was, at the time the Concorde was conceived and was built, the fuel costs were not very important. And in fact, there was a very interesting paper written in the Canadian Earth and Space Journal by Jack Diamond, who was chief engineer of Air Canada, about the selection of the Vickers Vanguard by Air Canada. I didn't even mention engine efficiency. You know, it was a non-issue. But now that in fact the fuel costs have started to go back up again. We're up to about $70 a barrel now. That it was running at as high as $150 a barrel, and there were people getting very excited about clever new aeroplanes, and all that kind of disappeared when the fuel costs went back down. But there's absolutely no question that Concorde was an amazing technical achievement, and that here we were flying across the Atlantic at Mach 2 40 years ago. But of course, it was not cheap. And but it was full of guys like John McEnroe and people like that had tons of money. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, because one of the big problems in all these fancy blended wings and whatnot is how do you get people out in the case of an emergency? You know, the Airbus demonstrated at Cranfield, they have a sort of a test rig for demonstrating or doing research on passenger evacuation, and but actually when Airbus certified the A380, they evacuated, I think it was 830 passengers in 90 seconds. You know, the airplane normally carries 400, 450, 500, but they actually demonstrated getting 830 people out in that time. So that's one of the huge problems on that. The other problem also comes with how amenable are these other designs going to be to loading freight? And that, because now it seems that on a lot of civil aircraft that the freight is quite a valuable commodity. I, in fact, in the days of Laker Skytrain, I was working for the Royal Navy in the UK at the time, and I took a standby fare on Laker to Houston. And I was coming back from Houston, and I phoned up the night before and said I wanted a standby fare to London tomorrow. Well, that's fine. Airplane's wide open. Got to the airport and said I wanted to buy a standby ticket. We're not carrying any passengers, any standby passengers tonight. I said, how come? They said, it's wide open. They said, oh, we're flying a lot of high-value freight to the Gulf tonight, so that the freight is more valuable than the passengers, so there are no standbys. But however, if you pay $50, you get onto a bottom dollar fare, and that's got higher priority than freight. So here's my $50. So I was upgraded above the freight. And as my bag went down the chute, I saw sort of a red sticky label on it, and it said innocently, what's that red label? Oh, that's standby for your luggage. It depends on the weight, whether it gets on or not. I said, well, how do you know? Oh, you get to the other end and it's not there. So the freight is in fact quite valuable, sometimes more valuable than you or I. Well, the only really big one like that is the A380, and I showed the fuel efficiency on that, and it's as good as it's right up at the top. I think the thing is that we're going to find that Airbus have argued for a long time, I actually always agreed with this, that the A380 really depends on sort of airport congestion. I've been in places like Johannesburg, where there were 4 747s leaving for London in half an hour, 2 each South African, 2 each British. Same sort of thing in Hong Kong, same sort of thing in Sydney. So if you've got a large volume of passengers passing through an airport that's very busy, really that you do need a big aeroplane to do that. The trouble is there's not that many airport routes, city pairs that carry that volume of traffic. So that I think there will always be a relatively small market for a very big aeroplane. But of course, now that you look at Air Canada can squeeze 400 people into a 777, not to be recommended. That of course is more like freight, 10 abreast in the 777. Well, the thing is, there are remarkably few blade failures in the, at the time of the A380 that had a turbine disc failure out of Singapore, Bloomberg News phoned me up and asked me a lot of questions about this, and I did a bit of checking into this, and I found a surprising number of unreported, uncontained failures, mostly in GE engines, which in fact, a lot of them occurred in cargo airplanes where nobody really noticed. But the actual number of times that a fan blade fails is very, very infrequent. Now recently that Air France lost a whole fan on A380 over Greenland. And the thing is, fatigue, you can't really see it until it happens. And there's been several cases with fan blades. Southwest have had 2 similar failures, and that's what they're worried about. There was some way apart. But if you look at the number of engines out there flying, and the number of times this happens, it's remarkably few. Now, there was a place on an earlier version of the CFM56, there was an accident in Britain where British Midland 737 actually had a fan failure, and a blade came off, and there was so much vibration on this engine that they actually shut down the instrumentation was actually very badly laid out, and they actually shut down the wrong engine And then on final approach into Birmingham, where they tried to do a diversion, they opened up the throttle, and the engine that was already heavily damaged just blew up, and the aircraft crashed. But there's very, very few failures like that. Certainly the biggest failure we've had ever on a civil aircraft was that turbine disc failure on the A380 with Qantas out of Singapore. And it survived that. That was kind of amazing. Because there's no way, if you have a disc failure, there's no way you can contain that, period. And in fact, there have been a famous incident at Sioux City, the DC-10, where the fan disc failed, and the aircraft crashed. It happened in a Canadair regional jet. They never found the disc. But these are very, very few and far between. And very, very... Let me ask a question, there's a lot of you out there. How many of you have experienced that shut down on a turbine engine? And the answer is, I asked this question, I did the Guggenheim lecture in Toronto, 2005 I think it was, and there were 600 people there. And I asked, how many people here have experienced an in-flight shutdown? One old guy put up his hand. So I innocently asked, what sort of aeroplane was that on? He said, a B-29. Which is going back some. No, I have experienced an in-flight shutdown. It was on a Britannia. That was in 1959, and that's nearly 60 years ago. And the reliability of the modern engines is just astonishing. So let me answer that question by saying, the Pratt & Whitney geared fan, there's been more hype about that, what a wonderful idea it is, and how many people recognize that the first successful geared fan was the Garrett 731, which was certified in 1972, and 12,000 have been built. So there's been geared fans around for 40 years. The point is that as we go to higher and higher bypass ratios, that eventually that every is being driven to go into a geared fan, because the turbine, the LP turbine, driving a low-speed fan of very large diameter, becomes so massive that it really becomes a critical item. A few years ago, I did a study, and I came across a report by Douglas or by GE, which showed the return on investment of spending money on the low-pressure turbine on a CF6 wasn't worth bothering about. All the real cost savings came on the high-pressure compressor and the high-pressure turbine. On the 787, both Rolls and Pratt were way down on the target SFC because of problems with the LP turbine. And the LP turbines are now becoming more and more critical, and as you want to push the bypass ratio up, they become ever more critical, ever heavier. A lot of work going on to replace steel blades in the back end with titanium aluminide. A lot of work going on here doing that. But Rolls, in their latest, what they call the ultrafan engine, they are actually going to a gearbox and a variable pitch fan, largely cut down the number of turbine stages. We're at a stage now where it is very, very difficult to get further improvements. We've got a really, really efficient system that's come from God knows how many years of development. And as I always point out to my students, that everything you do to raise the efficiency of the engine raises the problem of engine life. I mean, you want to put it's interesting, in fact, that when I started working on the early engines like the Render, that we're now finishing up with compressor delivery temperatures almost as high as the turbulent temperature was on engines like the Render. So that when you start getting up to these levels of temperature, it doesn't take very much to burn out a turbine and lose an engine. So I'm amazed at how seldom we actually do get failures in these components. So I think that if you went, say, from the from the 707 engine to the 747 engine, there was about 20–25% improvement in fuel. You went to the next generation, there was maybe another 10%. And it's getting harder and harder and harder to squeeze more out of it. Now, the encouraging thing about the Pratt GTF is that although they've had lots of problems, in fact, none of them appear to have been with the gearbox. But there have been all sorts of other problems that you wouldn't have expected in the combustion system and compressor seals and stuff like that.
Thank you very much, Herb. Two talks instead of one tonight. That was really good. Thank you.
There's an old saying in Glasgow, don't clap, throw money.
You knew that if you were a girl.